Welcome to the Wizard Tower Art Podcast. Today's episode, we'll be focusing on how to improve your art in a practical and applicable way. But before we get into it, it's time for the big artist showcase. And today's showcase goes to the great Caravaggio, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. I hope I didn't butcher that. Was an Italian painter active in Rome, Naples, Malta, and Sicily from the early 1590s to 1610s. As noted on Wikipedia, his paintings combine a realistic observation of the human state, both physical and emotional, with a dramatic use of lighting, which had formative influence on Baroque painting. So Caravaggio is such a great painter. I really like his use of chiaroscuro. Some people call it tenebrism, and it's basically the use of high contrast to really highlight the focus of a painting and just letting the rest get immersed in darkness, sometimes with gray, reddish, or greenish tones. His famous works include The Beheading of Holofernes, a painting of Saint Jerome being divinely inspired, and David with the head of Goliath, all exhibiting stunning realism and very dark both metaphorically and literally, and gritty scenes of blood and murder, but also divine intervention and glory. And so if by any chance you haven't heard of Caravaggio, I really recommend that you check him out. You can go to caravaggio-foundation.org to check out his complete works. That's caravaggio-foundation.org. Today's art topic is how to improve your art. This is not going to be a nice pat on the head. It's time to get real. And one of the first and most important things you should know about improving with your art is that motivation will only take you so far. It is time that you employ discipline. If you're having trouble with that, it will be very hard for you to get a foot on the door. Discipline means setting up a schedule where you say, I'm going to draw every single day at least 1 hour, for example. And it doesn't matter if you hate it. It doesn't matter if you're sick. It doesn't matter if you don't feel like doing it. You must draw. Now, some people don't draw because they don't feel like it, and they say, well, I don't even know what to do. I'm having an art block. And to that I say, you do not need to be creative to improve your draftsmanship. There's always 7 pillars of art that you can improve without creative input. The 7 elements of art are line, shape, space, value, form, texture, and color. These are the building blocks of what makes up art. Do you not feel creative? It doesn't matter. You can still practice a clean line art, especially if you haven't mastered drawing with your forearm and or shoulder instead of your wrist. You're not writing, after all. So what I suggest you to do is go through these 7 elements, cycle through them, experiment. Set up exercises for it. In the description, I'll leave a few links to free books. You need to study, and you need to set up a schedule. Now, hold on a second. Maybe you're saying, do I have to study as if it was school and work? And the answer is yes, sadly. There is such a thing as talent, but it's nothing compared to hard work and dedication. If you do not want to approach this as an assignment or something rigid and boring, you can take the practical approach, and that is art studies. And to perform art studies, you can either take a famous painting you enjoy and try to replicate it. It doesn't matter how badly you think you're doing it. Or you can go out in the world and attempt to replicate it. But let me be the first one to tell you that if you attempt to tackle real art pieces or the world without practicing your fundamentals, I think it's akin to trying to multiply before you even learn how to add or subtract. But that's my experience. Now, the point of this episode is to give you concrete plans to improve. So I'm going to go through each of these elements of art and provide you with an idea of an exercise you could perform. You have to do something. But please do not despair. This is good news. It means anything you do, even when you're feeling an art block, can improve your art. But again, the key is to do something as opposed to nothing, as opposed to saying, oh, my art sucks, let's not even try, or as opposed to putting it off for later. You must do it now. Preferably, draw every day. If you can't, set up a schedule where you draw several times a week. So let's get started with the elements of art, shall we? So let's get into a practical approach. You need to learn to love shapes. A square, a circle, a line. They sound easy, they might sound boring, but can you successfully and reliably make a circle? This is a real question. Can you literally take your pen to paper and make a circle without hesitating? Have you successfully eliminated what is called chicken scratch when you make lines? You need to learn how to make flowing lines coming from your forearm. Any of these things have to be practiced and can be polished, just as a cook has to practice their techniques to improve their cooking. And so, a very real way to practice your shapes would be to simply say, every day I'm going to make 20 circles. They have to be made as good as you can make them, without clawing on your pen or pencil. You have to be subtle. If you need to learn how to hold your pencil, there is no shame in that. There is skill and technique required. I recommend watching Proko's video on how to hold your pencil. It is essential and you will start noticing immediately the difference. If you aren't already doing it, of course. Now, once you have your 20 circles every day, you start making more, or you start changing your approach to encompass other elements of art. How about you try to shade the circle? Do you know all the parts of the circle in terms of art? I'm not saying you need to learn it like an assignment, but at least identify it when you see them. You have your tone, you have your highlight, your shadow edge, your core shadow. Well, they're the same, but depends on how you call them. You have your penumbra, your umbra, your reflected light, you have your terminator light. All of these elements have to do with shape and how it interacts with light. And so, since this is a podcast and not really an art video, I cannot show you, but I assure you that if you have these elements at your disposal, you will improve your art much faster than if you try to aimlessly replicate reality without a guideline. Here's another practical exercise. Why not take a comic or manga that you enjoy and copy it, panel by panel, frame by frame? If you feel like the work you chose is out of your league, you can even start by tracing. Some people believe tracing is cheating, but I think it depends on what you're practicing on. If what you're practicing is construction and perspective, perhaps there's something to it. But if what you're practicing is your line, how you hold your pencil, the way you manage the page under your arm, the way you sit, your posture, which are very important things, I think tracing is a good way to get started. You could start tracing a few pages, and then when you get that down, you can start having your page and your target comic side by side and just start attempting to duplicate it. This will improve your vision and your attention. And if you're actually paying attention, it will help you notice how other artists work when it comes to aligning their shadows to a certain point of light, for example. Every single thing you learn, it doesn't matter how small it is another building block to making your style. And if you fear that your art style will just become a copycat of that person, that is up to you. Your style is nothing but an amalgamation of your temperament and every other style you've ever seen and been influenced by. Another practical exercise is to take a painting you enjoy and attempt to replicate it while it's upside down, or by trying to paint its negative space, that is, the shape you get after you remove the actual shapes of the painting. For example, if you're watching a painting of a subject with their arms to the sides, perhaps you get a white triangle as the background when it comes to connecting the shoulder, the elbow, and the hand. How about this other exercise? You can pull up images, you can go to the park, you can ask a family member or a friend. Try to draw people in the most big picture way possible. That is, attempt to capture their movement with a single shape. This is called gesture drawing, and you can find it online easily. There's even websites that let you glance at pictures for a minute or so and then switch, so that you train your ability to identify basic shapes. This is obviously subjective and depends on your style, but in general, you will have an easier time perfecting a drawing if you start with the basic shapes and then make the smaller and complex ones, instead of going sequentially with one object connecting to the next. Here's another idea. Paint still life, that is, inanimate objects or dead animals. And no, you don't have to kill them. I mean, you could look them up in Google, I guess, but you might not be into that. I get it. If you don't feel confident enough to ask a person to pose for you, perhaps you can draw inanimate objects. And you can get very creative with it and have some fun. Why not buy colored lights? Take an object and put the different colored lights on different directions. This will make for an interesting painting or drawing, while also teaching you exactly how light bounces and the way shadows are affected by the light projecting them. Again, I must remind you, pick and choose any of these, or none at all, but do something. I know it sounds strange that I keep hammering that on, but the only thing I wouldn't want you to do is to close this podcast and say, "Oh sure, I will practice, but later, or tomorrow, or maybe never." That's the one thing I wouldn't want you to do. And finally, for this section, perhaps you don't feel motivated because it feels all samey. Oh, art is always the same, you may think. It's landscapes, it's people, but you always have the opportunity to break that mold. You wanna feel really adventurous? Paint a toilet. I'm serious. There's some skill required to convey the reflections. Paint a trash can filled with garbage. Paint a wall that's been smeared by animal waste and graffiti. Well, the non-artistic kind of graffiti, where it's just insults, I guess. Did a piece of furniture, a toy, or an appliance just break? Immortalize it before you throw it to the trash. How about you paint or draw that messy room you have, with clothes all over the place? How about you make a drawing of that crazy morning after a party, with empty bottles of beer on the table? And you can really capture the mayhem of the situation. Paint a historical figure flipping the bird to the audience. Do something different. You're an artist. Use that power. I really hope these suggestions have been useful. Please let me know in the comments if any of these worked for you. I'd really appreciate it. This episode of the Wizard Art Podcast was brought to you by no one. But it still feels cool to make this voice. Today's small artist of the day is Kathy Diaz, at Priichu on Twitter. Or maybe it's Priichu, I don't know. That's Priichu. I was a bit hesitant about promoting her as a quote-unquote small artist. She has 16.8k followers on Twitter after all. But I think that even though that's big on the internet world, it's still small when you think about the big picture and the history of art. So what the hell? Kathy Diaz is a freelance 3D artist, and I really enjoy her low poly model work. She also has excellent drawing skills and makes very diverse and cute characters. So please make sure to check her out, and maybe join her Patreon. I'll leave a link to her stuff in the description. That's Kathy Diaz at Priichu, Priichu on Twitter. Today's social media topic of the day is not really anything. I was having a bit of a mental block, ironically enough, considering the last segment. There are quite a few social media topics I'd like to talk about, but they have the same problem as the fictional minor exploitation one that we discussed last episode. These topics can get controversial really fast, not to mention depressing as well, and I'm not sure if this is the right direction for the podcast. Not necessarily for having controversial opinions, but part of the ideal of this podcast is to escape the horribleness of the world and to enjoy something we like, which is art. But as everything, the shadows permeate our sphere, and bad things happen in relation to it. There's very heavy topics that have to do with art, like the separation of art from artist, and how some people make good art while being terrible monsters. And the idea that the logical conclusion of evading any bad actor being an artist at several degrees of separation will leave you unable to enjoy anything, really. What if I talk about the percentage of the population that actually uses social media and how it represents the majority's opinion or not. I can discuss the way cancel culture is not healthy, but now people blame it for everything and all the bad things they do and justify them by saying Twitter is wrong, they cancel people. I could talk about the plague that is reposting on Instagram, for example. You see many accounts with beautiful art, and they have produced none of it. And even if some of them, because not all of them, even if some of them actually credit the artists, how many people do you think are actually clicking through? They just like the post and move on. I could talk about art product platforms for independent artists such as Society6 and Redbubble, and how I can see a constant influx of artists complaining that their work has been stolen and resold on a cheap t-shirt. And the colors are not even right because presumably they left them on RGB instead of CMYK. I can talk about representation and the pros and cons it has, and how sometimes it feels like you cannot support either side because both of them can be pretty dumb depending on who gets to hold the microphone in the comments section. People who claim to accept trans people but get outraged every single time any of them are revealed to be in a show or movie. I could talk about how some considerable portion of the Twitter and Instagram sphere thinks that you can only draw a white character if you're white and a black character if you're black. Am I supposed to be limited to draw Hispanic characters because I'm Mexican? All of this sucks. I could talk about the stagnation that comes from people assuming they're perfect the way they already are, even though that's demonstrably untrue. But since we've had rough childhoods sometimes, we don't like being told the same thing our parents were telling us all the time. We want validation, which is perfectly healthy, but like most things, excess is where things go wrong. I could talk about the idea of trigger warnings and academic evidence suggesting that they don't work and they can even make people more anxious since they're expecting something bad to happen in what they're watching. I can talk about cynicism and the 17 layers of irony we all seem to be delving in. People ignore the psychological effects of always being negative out loud. Even if you do it as a joke, it can make you bitter. And no, I'm not saying that you cannot joke about things. I'm saying that the conversation itself has been poisoned by people who want to take extremes on both sides all the time for everything. I can talk about my frustration on the fact that even if you try not to engage in political discourse, some people will tell you that you are already part of the problem because if you're not constantly in a struggle for survival, it must mean that you are an oppressor because you benefit from the status quo. And again, I'm aware, vocal minority, but the way our brains are wired to perceive negative emotions makes it so that we notice these things more than the positive things. I'm sure you've seen this happen. All of these topics are, in my opinion, tangentially related to social media and art. But I wouldn't want to bog down my show into basically being a bummer every episode. I'm actually not sure how to go about this, and so I decided that for today's second half, I would just lay down these points and ask you, what would you like? You can add Wizard Tower Art at Twitter, or leave a comment. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wizard Tower Art Podcast. As always, I am legally required, not really, to remind you to like this video and subscribe, and also follow me on Twitter at CryomancerLex and at Wizard Tower Art. I also want to remind you that the Wizard Tower Art Podcast airs every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Central Time. That is 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I think 11 a.m. in West Coast Time. Regardless, thank you very much for listening. I'll see you around. Bye bye.